March 1967, the dry season in Truong Son, the forest was no longer wet, the ground had hardened, and sound traveled far. A soldier did not look up at the sky first, he listened. A rhythm, whop whop, steady, heavy, and foreign to the jungle. A UHAP-1 helicopter. In Truong Son, if you could hear it, it meant it had already been there. The Truong Son Trail did not appear on any American military map. Yet from 1965 to 1967, tens of thousands of people moved along it every month, not with tanks, not with motorized convoys, but with human shoulders, bare feet, and time. The Americans called it the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a name that made it easier to mark. But to those who walked it, it meant only one thing. If this road died, the war would end. By 1966, the Americans believed they had found the answer. Armed helicopters, flying low, flying slow, at just the right altitude to see every movement beneath the jungle canopy. The doctrine stated clearly that enemy infantry was incapable of shooting down a maneuvering helicopter. This was not an assumption, it was written as belief. And when belief enters doctrine, it begins to kill people. On the night of March 11, 1967, a transport unit of 14 people crossed a small clearing in western Quang Binh. They carried ammunition, medical supplies, and letters that had never been sent. When the sound of rotor blades appeared, no one shouted, no one ran. Everyone lay flat, because running beneath a helicopter was the fastest way to die. Among them was one man who was different. While everyone pressed their bodies into the ground, he kept his head raised for a few more seconds. Not out of bravery, but out of habit. He watched the way the helicopter tilted its nose, the brief slowing of the rotor rhythm, and the moment when the sound lagged by a beat. Most people missed that moment. A hunter did not. Before 1964, he had never held a military rifle. He lived by the forest, hunting, setting traps, reading tracks. The forest taught him something no book ever could. The most dangerous moment is not when prey is strongest, but when it is about to change direction. He did not know military terminology, but he understood instinct. On March 14, 1967, the helicopter returned. The first pass was reconnaissance, the second pass was confirmation, the third pass was killing. Gunfire swept across the clearing. When the shooting stopped, 3 men did not stand up again. There was no time to mourn. Only one question repeated in his mind: what if I had fired earlier? In the military, some thoughts are forbidden. One of them is the idea that an infantryman can do something the doctrine says is impossible. He never spoke it aloud, he only kept it in his head, and began to observe more closely. There was no watch and no measuring device. He counted using heartbeats, breaths, and the number of times a helicopter turned. He discovered that each turn caused the helicopter to slow briefly, the tail rotor became more exposed, and the sound lost its steady rhythm. No one taught him this. No one permitted him to believe it. He kept a small notebook with no cover, cigarette paper, and charcoal. He wrote, "Lead the shot, don't chase it. Fire when it turns. Don't wait for it to fire first. If discovered by his superiors, he could be disciplined. But if he did not write, he knew more men would die. There was no firing range, no trial run. The correct moment came only once. And if he was wrong, he would not be the first to die." By the end of March 1967, Truong Son remained silent, but within that silence, something impossible had begun to take shape in the mind of an unnamed soldier. In war, every real change begins this way: in silence, in isolation, and without permission to be right. He was born before the war had a name. In a mountain village where seasons mattered more than dates, he learned early that survival depended on noticing small changes. The bend of grass, the silence of birds, the way wind moved differently when something larger disturbed the forest. His father taught him nothing about war, only how to wait. They hunted not by chasing, but by letting the forest reveal its rhythm. An animal never died because it was weaker. It died because, for a fraction of a second, it hesitated. That lesson stayed. When he was called to join the army in the early 1960s, he carried no sense of heroism with him, only the habits of someone who had learned to live by observation. In training, he struggled with formal drills. He did not shoot faster than others. He did not march better. He was quiet, often mistaken for slow. But in the field, he listened. By late 1966, helicopters had become a constant presence. They did not hunt like animals. They hunted like machines. Predictable, confident, repeating patterns because doctrine said they were untouchable. He noticed that confidence first. A helicopter never attacked immediately. It circled, it confirmed, it returned. The space between those actions mattered. In late March 1967, after another transport unit was forced to scatter under fire, he spoke for the first time. Not loudly, not formally, just a sentence offered to no one in particular. It slows before it turns. No one responded. In war, silence is often safer than disagreement. So he stopped speaking and began preparing. He adjusted nothing on his rifle. He did not modify the weapon. He modified himself. He learned to raise the barrel earlier, to ignore the body of the aircraft and watch the motion instead, to fire where it would be, not where it was. Each time a helicopter appeared, he rehearsed the movement without shooting, lifting, tracking, lowering, again and again. By early April 1967, he was certain of only one thing. If he waited for permission, the moment would pass. The next opportunity came without warning. A supply group was pinned near a ridgeline just after dawn. The helicopter approached from the south, low enough to see the door gunner's silhouette. The order was clear: stay hidden, do not fire. He felt the hesitation in his chest, not fear, but calculation. The helicopter banked, the sound changed. He fired, one shot, then another. The second round struck metal, not flesh. The sound was wrong, sharp, irregular. The helicopter jerked, lost alignment, veered away. It did not crash where anyone could see it, but it did not return. No one cheered, no one spoke, orders were not discussed. The column moved. That evening, someone asked quietly how he knew when to shoot. He answered just as quietly. It told me. From that day on, the helicopters flew higher, not immediately, not officially, but gradually, enough to matter. No report mentioned his name, no citation followed, but fewer rotor sounds ended in gunfire. More supply groups reached their destination. By the time the rains came later that year, the forest had adapted again. So had the war. And the man who first listened never claimed to have changed anything. He simply returned to watching the sky and waiting for the next moment when something powerful hesitated. The helicopters did not disappear. They adapted. By mid-1967, their paths shifted. They approached faster, stayed higher, relied more on speed than confidence. Door gunners fired longer bursts, less precise but louder, as if noise itself could reclaim control of the ground. For most soldiers, this meant nothing had changed. For him, it meant everything had. Higher altitude shortened the window. Faster passes reduced hesitation. The moment he had learned to read became thinner, harder to feel. But it did not vanish. He adjusted again. He stopped watching the aircraft first. He watched the air around it. Dust lifted before sound arrived. Leaves trembled before the shadow crossed the ground. Birds rose in a pattern that repeated itself when danger approached from above. These were not military indicators. They were forest ones. He began to count less and feel more. When the helicopter came in fast, it always corrected itself once. Not much. Just enough. That correction was the opening. He did not fire often. Too many shots taught the enemy. One shot taught nothing. Sometimes weeks passed without him pulling the trigger. Others noticed the pattern before they understood it. When he raised his rifle, people around him pressed closer to the earth. Not because they were told to, but because something in his posture signaled certainty. By late summer, younger soldiers began to watch him instead of the sky. He never trained them formally. He never explained fully. He only corrected small things. Not yet. Lower. Wait. That was all. In August 1967, a helicopter came in unusually low, chasing movement along a narrow slope. It lingered too long, confident that the terrain protected it. The sound echoed differently there, bouncing instead of fading. He fired once. The helicopter climbed hard, trailing smoke. It did not fall, but it never returned to that sector. That night, the unit moved without interruption. No one recorded the event. There was no after-action report, just a quiet understanding that something subtle had shifted again. The war did not change all at once. It never does. It changes in margins, in habits, in the space between what is assumed and what is proven wrong. By the end of 1967, helicopters still ruled the sky, but no longer owned it completely. They searched faster. They left sooner. They hesitated more. That hesitation saved lives. He was never asked to demonstrate what he did. Perhaps because no one wanted responsibility for something unofficial. Perhaps because war prefers results without explanations. When new orders came, he moved on like everyone else. Different stretch of jungle, different ridgeline, same listening. Years later, when the war had moved on and names were being written into books, his was not among them. He did not expect it to be. He had never tried to prove anything. He had only responded to a question the war asked quietly, over and over again. What happens when the impossible pauses? And he had answered once with a single shot, and then with patience. When the fighting finally receded and he returned to civilian life, the forest welcomed him back without ceremony. Trees did not remember ranks. Paths did not ask where he had been. Sometimes, in distant valleys, he still heard aircraft, higher now, farther away. He did not look up. He listened. And when the sound passed without consequence, he continued walking, knowing that some changes leave no trace except the people who lived because of them. Time moved forward, but not evenly. In the years that followed, the war expanded, shifted, consumed new places and new people. Names of operations changed, equipment improved, commanders rotated in and out. But in the jungle, the fundamentals remained stubbornly the same. Sound still arrived before sight, movement still betrayed intent, hesitation still revealed vulnerability. He learned that war had a rhythm, just like hunting. Long stretches of waiting, punctuated by moments that demanded absolute clarity, not courage. Clarity. By early 1968, the air felt different, more crowded, more aggressive. Aircraft passed overhead more often, sometimes in groups, sometimes alone, testing routes that had once been avoided. The sky was no longer confident. It was cautious. Caution, however, does not mean safety. During one patrol, he noticed something new. Helicopters were beginning to fire preemptively, spraying likely positions without confirmation. It was an admission disguised as dominance. They no longer trusted what they could not see. That changed the ground war. People moved deeper, slower, smarter. They learned to disappear earlier, to let the aircraft waste its ammunition on shadows. Survival became less about resisting force and more about denying information. He fit into this shift naturally. He spent hours simply watching routes from concealment, mapping habits that were invisible to anyone who moved too quickly. He learned which valleys attracted repeated attention and which were ignored, which times of day the pilots favored, which angles they avoided. The sky, like the forest, had preferences. He shared none of this formally, not because he was secretive, but because language failed to capture what he sensed. These were not instructions that fit onto paper. They were understandings that lived in the body. Once, a young soldier asked him directly why helicopters always seemed to leave earlier when he was present. He thought for a long moment before answering. Because they feel watched, he said. The soldier laughed, unsure whether it was a joke. It was not. Machines do not feel fear, but people inside them do. And people sense when something has shifted against them, even if they cannot name it. As months passed, his role became less visible, but more influential. He was often positioned where routes narrowed or where sound behaved strangely. Not by order, but by habit. Others deferred without discussion. When he shook his head, people waited. When he nodded, people moved. By the time the rains returned that year, he had fired fewer shots than almost anyone in the unit. Yet his presence had become quietly essential. War tends to reward excess. Noise, movement, proof. It rarely acknowledges restraint. But restraint was his weapon. When peace finally came, it did not arrive all at once either. It seeped in gradually, unevenly, like light through broken canopy. Units dissolved, weapons were returned, men went home carrying things they could not explain. He returned to the forest, not as a soldier, not as a marksman, simply as someone who knew how to listen. He never spoke about helicopters unless asked. And when asked, he did not describe tactics or moments of action. He spoke instead about waiting, about noticing when something powerful assumes it is safe. Years later, when roads replaced trails and the sky grew busy again for different reasons, people sometimes spoke of the war in absolutes. Victories, defeats, turning points. He did not correct them. He knew that history often overlooks the smallest pauses, the brief seconds when certainty falters and outcomes change. He had lived inside those seconds. And he understood that some of the most important acts in war leave no monument, no record, no name, only silence, and the lives that continue within it. After the war, silence became easier, not because memories faded, but because the world no longer demanded constant alertness. The forest returned to being just a forest. Wind no longer carried threat by default. Sound lost its edge. At first, he struggled with that. Years of listening for danger had sharpened something in him that did not dull quickly. Even in peace, his body reacted before his mind. A sudden noise, a low vibration, a shadow moving faster than expected. But over time, the tension loosened. He built a small life that required little explanation. A house close to trees, work that followed daylight and weather rather than schedules. People in the village knew he had been away, but they did not ask where or how. Everyone carried something. Respect meant leaving it untouched. Occasionally, younger men asked about the war. Not tactics, not victories. They asked what it felt like. He told them it felt like waiting while knowing that a mistake could not be corrected. He told them that courage was overrated, that most survival came from attention, from noticing what others dismissed as background. They listened politely, unsure what to do with answers that did not fit stories they had heard elsewhere. As years passed, the helicopters of his memory were replaced by different sounds: trucks, construction, distant aircraft flying high and straight, indifferent to the ground below. The sky had changed again. Sometimes, standing at the edge of the forest, he would pause when an aircraft passed overhead, not because he feared it, but because his body still measured it. Speed, altitude, direction. Old habits do not disappear. They simply lose urgency. He never wrote anything down after the war. No memoir, no record. He did not feel anything was missing. What he had learned belonged to a specific place and time. Outside of it, the knowledge was weight without purpose. When he grew older, walking became slower, hearing softened. The forest grew louder as his own senses dimmed. In a way, it felt balanced. Near the end of his life, he was asked once more, by someone who knew a little more than most, whether he believed his actions had changed the war. He thought about it carefully. No, he said. The war was too large. Then, after a pause, he added, but some people arrived where they were going. That was the closest he ever came to claiming anything. When he died, there was no ceremony beyond what the village offered. No mention of helicopters. No stories told publicly. Just a name, a date, and a life folded back into the ground it had come from. The forest did not mark the passing. But somewhere in the distance, long after the war had ended, the sky remained higher than it once had been. And that was enough. There is a temptation when looking back to search for moments that feel decisive. A single shot, a single action, a single person. But war rarely works that way. What he did mattered not because it was dramatic, but because it was repeatable without being copied. Others did not imitate his exact actions. They absorbed the idea behind them, that the sky was not absolute, that patterns could be read, that certainty could be challenged. Those ideas moved quietly, passed in fragments, never formalized. They survived because they were useful, not because they were celebrated. Long after his death, no document carried his name. No archive linked a change in flight behavior to an unnamed soldier watching from the trees. Histories spoke of adaptation, of evolving tactics, of lessons learned on both sides. All of that was true and incomplete, because somewhere beneath those explanations lived a simpler truth. Dominance weakens the moment it stops listening. He had listened when others assumed. He had waited when others rushed. He had acted when the window was real, not when it was permitted. That combination does not belong to one war or one country or one time. It appears wherever systems grow confident enough to believe themselves immune. In that sense, his story was never about helicopters. It was about attention. Attention as resistance. Attention as survival. Attention as the quiet refusal to accept what is declared impossible. The forest understood this long before humans put it into words. Predators that stopped listening starved. Prey that ignored subtle signs did not pass on their instincts. He had learned that lesson early, carried it through violence, and returned it intact to the land that taught it to him. Nothing about his life demanded remembrance. Nothing about his actions required applause. Yet the absence of his name does not diminish the presence of his effect. Somewhere between the sky and the ground, between doctrine and reality, there is always a space where certainty hesitates. That space is small, it is brief, and it is enough. He lived there for a time. Then he let it close behind him, leaving no trace except the continued breathing of those who never knew why they were spared. and that perhaps is the most complete ending war ever allows. Even now, when the story is told by others, it is often reshaped. Details are sharpened, timelines are straightened, causes are made to look clearer than they ever were. This is not done out of malice. It is how people try to make sense of violence after it has passed. But he would not have recognized those versions. To him, nothing felt clean or linear. Each moment was surrounded by uncertainty, each decision balanced between action and restraint. There was never a sense of control, only alignment, brief and fragile, between observation and necessity. He never believed he had mastered anything. He believed only that paying attention reduced waste, waste of movement, waste of ammunition, waste of lives. In the jungle, excess was punished. Noise attracted danger. Repetition invited response. Predictability was a form of surrender. These lessons applied as much to armies as they did to animals. He had simply applied them when others could not afford to. If asked what he feared most during the war, he would not have named death. Death was present everywhere, familiar enough to lose its edge. What he feared was blindness. The moment when habit replaces awareness. The moment when confidence silences curiosity. The moment when a system stops questioning its own assumptions. That was when people died unnecessarily. Long after the conflict ended, he sometimes listened to speeches on the radio, analyses, conclusions, declarations of meaning. He turned them off more often than not. Meaning he knew did not arrive in statements. It emerged in consequences. A helicopter that turned away sooner than expected. A patrol that reached shelter unobserved. A night that ended without gunfire. These were not events that made history. They were events that allowed life to continue. And life, continuing quietly, was the only outcome he had ever aimed for. In the end, his story resists ownership. It belongs neither to victory nor defeat, neither to strategy nor legend. It exists in the narrow space between them, where individuals act without certainty and accept responsibility without recognition. That space still exists, not just in war, but wherever power assumes safety, wherever speed replaces attention, wherever doctrine hardens into belief. Someone, somewhere, is always listening more carefully than expected. Not to challenge the world, not to prove a point, but to notice when the impossible pauses. And when it does, they will act briefly, precisely, and then disappear back into the background, leaving only an absence where danger once was. No names, no monuments, just the quiet continuation of things that were not supposed to survive. There could always be more words, more reflection, more distance, more interpretation layered onto what was already simple. But the truth is that the story does not continue forward. It spreads outward. It lives in every situation where someone notices what others overlook, where rules say cannot, and reality quietly says, not yet proven, where survival depends less on force than on awareness. Nothing about him was unique in isolation. What mattered was alignment between experience, patience, and the willingness to act without permission. That alignment appears briefly, then vanishes. It cannot be summoned. It cannot be taught in full, only recognized when it arrives. So if you are asking whether there is more, the answer is yes, but not on the page. It continues wherever certainty grows loud enough to stop listening, wherever power forgets that it too leaves traces. Wherever someone waits long enough to hear the difference between movement and intent, that is where the story resumes, not as memory, not as history, but as a moment, small, silent, and decisive. Not in a linear sense anymore. This story has no continuation in the form of event, action, outcome, because it has reached the point where all honest war stories eventually stop, when there is no war left to react to, and only the human being remains. If it continues at all, it can only exist as an after echo, not as progression. And the final echo is this: no one builds monuments for moments that never happened. No one records battles that were stopped inside a thought. No one counts the deaths that never arrived. History is always written by what explodes. But war itself is decided by what is restrained in time. That soldier left no method behind, no doctrine, only a quiet truth, that any system, no matter how powerful, will reveal its weakness at the moment it believes it has none. And somewhere, there is always someone listening for that moment. Not to become a hero, not to change history, only to make sure that a few more people will live to walk forward. If it must end at a single point, then it ends here. No further action, no additional climax, Only the silent continuation of life, the thing war never records, yet fears the most.